Potholes and Politics, Local Maine Issues from A to Z. I'm your co-host, Rebecca Graham, here with your other co-host, Rebecca Lambert, and we are here doing the Legislative Bulletin breakdown.
So we just finished up the second round of edits on our Legislative Bulletin. This was your first full week before the legislature, and they're actually getting some work done. What was your week like?
Busy, very, very busy, but it's been fun. I'm enjoying it. I feel like I have the newbie excitement going on.
So what was the most interesting bill that you listened to or learned about this week?
There was a lot of interesting bills, but the bill LD 122 that I just listened to yesterday on the medium duty and heavy duty zero emissions vehicles was really interesting. It's not a topic that I've really done much research on or listened to. So it was really interesting to hear the perspectives from the different auto dealers and manufacturers and associations that are out there.
Yeah, the stakeholder listening is an education. And that, I think, is one of the beauties of the process, is actually listening and learning to what, that are potentially affected by that legislation every day have about that, so that you can actually make that policy better. And it was one of the things that I liked when I first started my first week. I thought, oh, this is great. When you're in the committee room, the politics goes away and it's about policy, and it's about digging in and getting to that policy and figuring out how to achieve what it is that you wanted to achieve, kind of like marrying the possible with the practical, actual functional policy. And I thought under Zoom, that just completely evaporated, along with the engagement and the willingness to actually listen to folks. And in some ways, I think just listening on Zoom is really hard. It's really hard to sit there for 17 hours a day.
And I think in some of these topics that people are really interested in, they wind up getting in the weeds during these public hearings rather than just taking in the information and then leaving all these questions for the work session where they can work through it. But it made these public hearings really long. And I think when you're not in the room, you don't realize that that's part of the reason why it takes so long to work these bills. There's so much information being given.
Yeah. So in our legislative bulletin this week, we covered a few of those. And I was reminded with after the first one, actually, the bill that we'll talk about bad cops and background checks. I had forgotten how uncomfortable the seats are in the committee room and how disadvantaged some committees are with their space and their ability to actually house individuals for these public hearings. They usually will develop alternate processes in listening rooms, and some spaces in the legislature have a larger area for those folks. Criminal justice and public safety is not one of those rooms. You are stacked, two very tight rows, almost on top of the horseshoe, and with little space in between and no ability to move once you get seated without disturbing somebody else, unless you're in that front row. So
I've only had to participate by Zoom so far, so I haven't been in the committee rooms, but that sounds really COVID friendly.
Yeah, well, long before COVID, there were things like, seasonal flu and cold that are definitely passed around readily at the State House. I was eager to actually get back into committee because I think that's where the good conversations, or at least I thought, great, we're not going to be doing the Zoom. Folks are actually going to want to converse more so than they did in the Zoom reality and understand impacts and understand and incrementally change policy. So I was really eager to get back. I think it's easier to have conversations face to face. I'm not so sure that will be as productive as I thought it was going to be this year, but we shall see. So, Becky, we both wrote a few bulletin articles this week about some bills that impact municipalities from a pretty wide spectrum of policy areas. Why don't you tell me a little bit about your wandering cannabis bill?
Yes. And on Monday, the VLA committee heard LD 202, which clarifies the rules for off-premise sales for cannabis store licensees. Basically, this is a bill put forth by the Office of Cannabis policy. And it's to clarify the existing law that was passed last year, LD 1927, which was mirrored after the law authorizing the sale of Maine-made wine and beer and spirits, and it extended similar provisions to the sale of adult use cannabis at outdoor events like fairs, festivals, farmers markets, that sort of thing. So
what could go wrong?
So during that public hearing, MMA is neither for nor against this, since the provisions that require municipal approval for these events remains unchanged. But there was also testimony in support from OCP and also Alex McMahon, who was representing Medco. And he was testifying that he was mostly in support of it, but he was taking issue with two parts of the bill. The first part was that it allowed OCP approval or authority over what kind of and where the events took place. They didn't think that there needed to be any more oversight since municipalities have that approval authority. Also, he takes issue with the prohibition on the sale of adult use cannabis products that can be smoked. So no flower, but you can sell plants and you can sell edibles, which I think would be much harder to enforce the consumption of at these kind of events. But basically, they wanted to make sure that you couldn't have a sale of these kind of products at, say, a little league game or, trying to make sure that it's not going to get in the hands of minors who don't need to have these products.
Yeah. I think I understand why they did that in a couple of different ways, in that the office can only take enforcement action against licensed providers. So I think they do need to have some of that oversight piece, and we need to have the flexibility as well to define what that is within our communities if we choose to opt in. But you can tell the difference between a joint and a cigarette,
right?
But you can't tell
unless you're tasting
an adulterated brownie and a non-adulterated brownie, or
just wait 3 hours and find out.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. That's going to be an interesting bill to continue to follow. But I know that it was a department-led bill, so they're looking for clarity and control over an interesting conundrum that events pose. We also know what a struggle that is, I think, in some cases, just around alcohol.
Yeah, there was discussion about regulating cannabis like you do alcohol, but I think where it's still illegal on a federal level, that presents challenges for regulating it like you would alcohol.
Yeah, absolutely. I mentioned I was in criminal justice committee this week and fondly forgetting how uncomfortable the chairs and their tight spaces, but I was sitting in on a bill that would basically enable police chiefs and hiring agencies to share information back to a current employer regarding background investigations for potential hires within law enforcement. The purpose is to try to take that information that may be uncovered when you're trying to hire someone and allow it to flow back to a current employer, particularly if it is potentially disqualifying behavior for an officer who is actually employed. That's information that, I think there's an obvious community desire and interest in having, but there's this at-will component in the public sector the private sector rather, that doesn't exist in the public sector. They're just cause only terminations. So there has to be an investigation and a number of other check boxes, basically, depending upon union contracts, et cetera. So it could potentially open up that agency who shared that information to being part of litigation for wrongful termination for an employee they never hired, because they do share that. I think we're keen to make sure that language gets clarified so that it provides, a chief gives them cover. So I think that's fixable, and the intent of the bill, I think municipal officials believe, is laudable as well within that gap.
Now, is this sharing of information, is this only during the hiring process, or is this at any point during their career? Like, say, for instance, an officer committed a crime while he was employed. Does that kind of information get shared?
They're all shared, like criminal behavior. And it's probably important to note that behavior that's disqualifying doesn't always necessarily rise to a criminal level. Things that are perfectly legal within a normal position, for instance, engaging in a relationship with someone that you meet in the course of your work, regardless of their situation, as long as it's consensual, that's perfectly legal. However, if you're a law enforcement officer, you engage in a sexual relationship with a member of the public who has been involved in a domestic violence incident, even if it's consensual, that you have responded to, that is disqualifying behavior. So not everything that comes out during a background process rises to a criminal intent. That's a public information process. So you can, once you're committed of a crime or, arrested of a crime, that can come out. And the current agency obviously would know about that if that was ongoing. But this is information that is almost like self-disclosed in some ways as a result of applying. There's a full background check that is done on you and a polygraph examination as well. And those are requirements of the academy, and that both of those processes can uncover information that wasn't previously known. For instance, they could have engaged in criminal activity in another state, and that other state didn't get around to entering that into their system. There's a backlog even within Maine, but that didn't come out until after. Also, current practice, like to disclose that information, you have a right of due process as well. So there's also a presumption that you have a right of reply. You have a right to actually defend yourself. And that's what the investigation of the currently employed agency would do. That would be that process. But if you didn't hire them and you disclose it, current practices, you need a waiver from that individual that they can disclose that information to your current employer. Just like your current employer needs a waiver to release that information to a potential employer.
Got it.
So there's due process rights on both sides, and no interest in having people that engage in such behavior as part of our communities or being in a position of authority that could potentially be harmful to victims of crime or bring disrepute to all the other agency officers. So there's definitely a clear public interest. And I think, it's probably a very extremely rare case. Usually bad behavior will out. That said, these processes have uncovered behavior that was really inappropriate, and there was a lot of legal questions about how to manage that. It's clearer when it's criminal, honestly, versus disqualifying.
So I understand you also sat in on a public hearing on LD 23 in the Judiciary Committee.
Yeah, so that kind of blends into this a little bit, but not really. It involves public safety and it involves data collection. And it involves and basically highlights the complexity of legal language and how it shapes those processes. So there's an e-citation module that has been developed by the Department of Public Safety, and that program has had an additional module added onto it which will be called the e-warning module. And the intent is to centralize and automatically transmit information directly to the Violations Bureau and issue a summons all at the same time. So the program itself does a few things. One is it reduces errors in the Bureau and within the court system, because the information is directly imported from the Bureau of Motor Vehicle records. So you're not having to translate bad handwriting or making spelling errors within the court record. And it also is now going to be used to collect all information regarding the perceived race of an individual during a traffic stop. If you are a participant, you're an agency that participates in that system. Right now, there's 35 agencies that participate in that system, including the Maine State Police. So that data can then be turned over to the Attorney General's office, who will compile the report and will have record of not only the citations that were issued, but the traffic stops that didn't result in any sort of summons or complaint of summons. And that's kind of key, because this data doesn't live within the court system and doesn't live within the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. It lives in this physical other space, in theory. The Department of Public Safety was hit with a big right to know request from a large data entity that municipal officials are frequently hit with, and they had to spend a considerable amount of time arguing that this was releasable and protected information, even when it didn't live within the data systems that are very obviously protected information, because it didn't exist. This e-citation program didn't exist at the time that they were carving out those database restrictions. So it's an interesting legal conundrum, but the department spent a considerable amount of time defending that so that personal information couldn't be used and basically tied to your credit report for non-adjudicated activity or contact with law enforcement that would then force you to, or potentially you would lose out on housing, or your insurance rates would be jacked up without you ever having received a fine, just by the number of times maybe law enforcement had pulled you over, regardless of that. So again, it was focused on that due process and release of information, that private release of information, which we ironically volunteer on a regular basis for free email and social connections. And it's really corporate data systems that are collecting, harvesting, and using our data and our patterns of behavior in ways to sell us products more effectively.
All the time.
Yeah, I can't wait to see what pops up on my phone for advertisements next time I go into it.
It seems like I'll just have a conversation with my husband, and then next thing I know, I have all these ads popping up on Google and in Facebook and everywhere else I look.
So what about rural areas? I think we got two bills that are kind of focused on rural areas.
LD 142 would fund climate-related service work, which would fully fund the Maine Climate Corps, which would connect members and host communities and organizations that need assistance implementing like energy efficiency programs, as weatherization programs, education on energy efficiency, and do-it-yourself home repair projects for community members. LD 143 will support rural service programming, which would seek to hire fellows, and those are typically recent college graduates, and they connect them with rural communities and nonprofits, and they help with community projects. Rural communities often don't have the capacity to participate in those traditional AmeriCorps programs. And this program, the Maine Service Fellows, kind of bridges that gap between the communities, and it would help build up the infrastructure that can be self-sustaining after the fellows have completed their work. Maine's larger communities don't really benefit from this, but they definitely support, anything that the state can do to help more rural communities build up their infrastructure, have progress with COVID recovery. Workforce development is a big key too. Identifying recent college graduates that would like to stay in the state and work within their community. It's really important.
That lift in rural areas is really important. And in some ways, some of the programs that I think could benefit from these folks actually are more significantly impacted in rural areas, like the age of our housing, which is already, amongst the oldest in the nation in rural areas. And if you're trying to deal with heating assistance or repair projects to improve the energy efficiency of a home, once it gets above a set threshold, which I used to be $10,000, I don't know what it is now, you can't do anything for that program, the LIHEAP program, on that house because it needs too much work. So even being partially warm at that point, even though it's not efficient, is enough to disqualify that house from getting repaired. So I can see, these types of programs also being a way to supplement some policy deficiencies within, I think, what are largely federal programs.
And where it would be state funded, there's so many funding priorities that it's questionable whether these programs would be funded, but they definitely have a lot of value in rural areas.
Yeah, just even the management of a fellow and that through that program, I mean, it requires a lot of administration, and most of those agencies and most of those towns and cities are part-time at best. So they don't really have a lot of admin and reporting structures that they can lift. So I think,
and very limited resources at that.
Yeah, extremely, but great need, and can benefit from innovation and, some free assistance in rethinking that. So those are great programs. I also had a waste management bill that came before ENR, and it was about the disposal of television sets.
Yes. This bill really surprised me because it never occurred to me to bring a television set to, say, Goodwill to dispose of it.
Yes, there is a lot of televisions that were made before now that actually lasted forever and still probably run. I bet the TV that I had when I was a kid, even though it had like the turn knob to snap.
Was it a big floor console version
No.
that took 4 people to move?
No, that was my dad's, definitely. And my mom just had that one moved out of the living room and replaced by my son's giant screen so that he could game when he came over. But those sets continue to work long after their usefulness and are often gifted to, or at least historically have started to be gifted to resellers who may or may not be able to find someone to take them over. So there's been a change in policy for a lot of those resellers like Goodwill and Salvation Army. They limit and close off the collection areas, making them secured and staffed only to accept donations so that they can try to alleviate some of the waste that inevitably happens when folks think they are being generous and donating their no longer useful items to someone who may or may not need or desire those useful items. So Senator Trey Stewart from Aroostook County introduced this bill that would basically make it impossible for municipalities to charge a fee for that waste management if the items were being dropped off by a charitable organization. And I think there is at least some motivation sometimes for these donations to go there because there are waste collection fees rather than pay that. You can gift it to be someone else's problem. That's again why many of the charitable organizations have started managing their drop-offs much more intensely. However, Aroostook County is vast and rural and has, like their areas, their service center areas are pretty far apart. So they have remote drop-off boxes still, the kind that you used to see. Maybe you didn't used to see, but I used to see as a kid.
I did.
Those big boxes. Well, they're still kind of a norm in Aroostook County, and they're dealing with a lot of unwanted items that get dropped off and have to shoulder the burden of the fees for that management, which is usually paid for through property taxes and fees, which nonprofits don't generally do or pay. So it was an interesting conundrum. I think officials are probably very sympathetic to that plight because they have to manage waste. They don't generate either. Senator Stewart recognized that the burden that this would simply shift the burden onto municipalities and also created a perverse incentive for folks that didn't want to pay the waste fee to donate it even more.
That's what I was just going to add.
Yeah. So during the public hearing, he introduced a amendment that suggested that rather than prevent municipalities from paying that fee or from absorbing that fee and not being able to charge, that the state absorb the fee, but he didn't have any constructions as to how that would happen and left it to the committee to decide how the state might assume that burden. The department was opposed to the bill and certainly didn't make any statements around the proposed amendment during the hearing, but can't imagine they will be willing to accept that fee either without forcing some sort of behavior change or rethink of the business model that inherently attracts that kind of gifting as well. Should be interesting.
Should be.
Have you been over to the State House yet?
I have not. I'm hoping to go over today to get my security badge at the executive director's office. That way I can kind of poke around a little bit.
I feel bad. I shouldn't. You definitely wouldn't want to have been stacked on everybody in criminal justice this week, but I should have dragged you along. Well, we are going to do an in-person roadshow, I think not next week, the week after, right?
Perfect.
It might be this week. I got to look at my calendar.
Well, this week is ending today, right?
Yeah. In my head, it has already ended. The bulletin is, it's in process. The week is over, although I know it painfully will not be over because I'll be writing all weekend and editing the podcast for release. So I think it's actually.
I will be focusing on writing testimony this weekend as well.
Yeah,
as well as some other creative elements.
That is the glory of session. Now I feel bad. Now I'm gonna have to, and now you're going over there by yourself, and that also seems wrong.
I did deliver my first ever testimony, which was on LD 202, the cannabis sales bill. So that was a little nerve-wracking because public speaking is not my thing. It makes my mouth go dry and I want to pee my pants and I start sweating profusely. So other than being on Zoom, nobody could see me sweating.
When we were hiring you? I don't remember.
I don't think I did, but I said I did
disclose something.
I disclosed that I was willing to step outside my box and learn new things and to push myself. This is the area that I'm pushing myself. So other than feeling like my mouth was full of cotton, I think I did okay. But there was tension and I felt like nobody wanted me there.
Yeah, you know what? That's what it's going to feel like every single time. That is what I have perversely missed, and at the same time was reminded that I don't miss, is that it is a citizen legislature. They put their pants on the same way that you and I do. And
they sure do.
They are incredibly human in the same ways that we are. I'm an only child, so I'm used to not being liked. So I don't care. Like, we're there to deliver the message, so I don't care.
Well, whenever I get nervous, I have a tendency to smile and laugh. So I probably look friendly.
Yes, that's probably it. I think that they will find that you're friendlier. But I think Kate is pretty fond of saying it's not our business what people think of us. Who cares?
Yeah.
And she's not wrong. And that's an easier thing to hear than it is to operationalize. So.
Well, and it takes a lot of pressure off where we have our LPC who sets the platform. So we didn't decide on this platform. We're just delivering the messenger. And I'm totally okay with being the messenger.
Yeah, the messenger always gets killed. But
yeah,
but I think
I'm a mom. I'm used to that. The messenger always gets killed.
It's a sign of deep thinking when folks actually listen and understand what it is that you're trying to say. And we have new and innovative ways, I think, of getting that information out. What's most important is that you are well loved within this team. And
oh, fantastic.
This is what feeds you and keeps you alive, honestly. Like us hanging out and commiserating about the week that was just before us, knowing that another week is coming that will be equally filled with highs, lows, and stresses, and the unique human dance that is politics.
Good stuff.
Yeah.
There we are then.
There we are then. Another episode of Potholes in Politics is in the bag. This is the first breakdown of the Legislative Bulletin, which is available on the MEMUN website, or the Maine Municipal Association website, under our publications. If you don't receive that in your inbox, if you would like to, then you can reach out to our associate extraordinaire, Laura Ellis, at lellis@memun.org, and you can have that delivered direct to your inbox before you listen to this podcast for the breakdown. Sometimes we're even cheeky in the bulletin. We'd like to think that it is fun to read while conveying a significant amount of what happened in Augusta this week.
In a fun and readable way. And then you get to listen to us talk about it.
Many more details, including what is in the hopper, what is coming down for public hearings next week that are of significant importance, and then what the committee schedules are looking like as well. I hope you have an amazing weekend, and
stay warm, everyone. It's going to be a cold weekend. Yes, the wood stove is cranking.
Yeah, I hope we don't lose power with all of this wind. The moon was amazing this morning, and the sky is brilliant and blue. I suspect that we are going to be plagued by looking at an outside that is absolutely gorgeous and inviting, only to walk outside and have
Your
light
nose hairs
out
freeze.
of you. Yeah, or your eyelashes.
Yeah.
All right, my dear. Have a great weekend, and
You too?
and I'll-
Yes. See you later.
bye.
Bye.